Last time we were together, we had a chance to look at an introduction to covenant relationships. Just to refresh our memories, basically a covenant relationship is a committed, community-based, kinship-creating. That idea of kinship, family. It creates family where there was none before. Kinship-creating, agape love relationship. And this can be between two or more parties. It's expressed in specific terms. It's grounded in mutual promises of faith and faithfulness. And what it does is it leads to the blessings of family. Identity, belonging, legacy, destiny, purpose and meaning. The things that family provides for human beings. What we're going to do in this next session is we're going to start walking through the 6 major covenants of Scripture. The 6 points, major points, in biblical history where God stepped into covenant relationship with human beings. We're going to start with the creational covenant in Genesis chapters 2, and we'll see quickly in 3 things go pretty badly. After that, we'll look at the covenant with Noah, Genesis chapter 6 to 9. Pretty soon, we'll get to the covenant of Abraham, which is a key moment. God covenanting with Abraham to have a nation. Genesis 12 up through 22 we'll be touching on. Fourth, we'll be looking at the Sinai covenant, which takes a whole lot of the rest of the books of Moses. Book of Exodus on into Leviticus and Numbers, Deuteronomy 2. Eventually we'll come to the covenant with David, the Davidic covenant, the promise that gives us the promise of Messiah. And finally, eventually we'll look at the new covenant through Jesus Christ, where all of the covenants that came before are fulfilled and summarized in this beautiful new covenant of Messiah Jesus. So to start out, we're going to be looking at Genesis chapters 1 through 3, the creation story, and seeing how the first covenant that God enters into with humanity is actually followed very quickly by the first human-to-human covenant. It becomes very clear that what this God is all about, this creative God who brings all things into being, what he's about, when he finally gets his creation set and his human partners created, he then steps into covenant relationship with himself and covenant relationship with each other. It's really all about covenant. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 28. We'll start there. This is that beautiful text where God's been creating these moments of creation, and now as he looks over everything, he says there's one thing missing, and that is his image. The image and the likeness of God. Nothing like that has been created yet. It's important to remember in the ancient world, the ancient Near East, in the cultural context of the Old Testament, the idea of an image was well known. A divine image was either a temple, an idol in a temple, a statue that had been dedicated to a particular deity, and that was then worshipped as a god. So an idol or some kind of statue that was divinely infused with energy and power and that was worshipped. Or the other thing that was called an image in the ancient world was a king. Now what they had in common, the statue idol or the king, was that in non-Jewish relationships, religions that believed in many gods, many spirits, in those religions, they believed that either the idols in their temples or their king as well was actually possessed in some sense. That their gods that they were worshiping, their spirit gods, came in and lived within the idols in their temple or the king in his palace. And it was through the idols in the temple that these gods could express and present themselves in the physical world. That's what an image of a god or divine being was. So when God, the true God, says that he's going to create his image, what he does is neither of those two things. He doesn't just create a stone statue and put it in a temple and have a lifeless image, nor does he take just a king, the elite, rich, of humanity, but rather God says that every human being that's going to come forth from the first pair, all of them will image the true God. This is a democratization, one could say, of the image of God. No longer is it just the king in the palace. It is every human being in every class, in every gender, in every culture or nation has the calling on our lives as human beings to be the image and likeness of God. With that, we see God's purpose for humanity, our fundamental job description, to image, again, to be a physical manifestation, a little bit of a glimpse, a reflection of the true God as we live in this world. Now, how do we do that? Of course, it's not that we're God. It's that because God takes up residence in his people, we can begin to love like the God who is love. We can begin to move in the four directions of love, as we so often talk about around here at Woodland Hills. Loving God, others, self, and creation, the four directions of love. As we do that in relationship, we image the God who is agape love. Now, with that as the ground, we then move to Genesis chapter 2. You can kind of think of these two creation texts as Genesis 1 being a bird's eye view, and Genesis 2 being a narrower picture, a more detailed focus on the creation of human beings and what our purpose is. So in Genesis 2, God now actually creates with the clay of the ground, the dust of the earth, creates Adam. Now, we often say Adam, the name of the first man, but let's remember that the name Adam is the Hebrew name Adam, the word Adam, and it literally means human being. So the first man's name in Hebrew is human being. It's the first image of this creator God. And God creates this image, this Adam, out of the dust of the ground. He fashions it. And it's not made out of, stone and wood. It's not overlaid with precious metals and jewels like the idols in the temples. It's just dust. But when this God is finished, he does something that no temple idol could ever do. This God breathes his breath into this image, and it becomes alive, a living image for a living God. Later in the Old Testament, we find that one of the chief problems God has with these false images and idols is that they're dead and lifeless. He talks about the fact, for example, in Isaiah that they can't hear and they can't speak. They're not a living image for a living God. Only human beings can image the true God who is the living God. And so God fashions this Adam, this first creature. And then he takes this Adam, this image, and he places him in a garden of Eden. And what's interesting is the imagery that we read about in Genesis 2 for this garden, this beautiful oasis, is very similar to the kinds of descriptions that we hear about with temples in the ancient world. It's like God is creating his own garden temple and placing his living image, not a dead stone idol, but a living representative in this beautiful garden oasis that is now a temple for God. Us as his image, reflecting his beauty and his love in this living garden. It's a very, very powerful image for the ancient world. Now what God does, as he has his image, his first human being in his garden, the first thing he does is he enters into a covenant relationship with him. Covenant, remember, is always expressed in specific terms that are pretty clear. And so what God does is he takes this human, puts him in the garden, and he says two things. I want you to cultivate, so work the ground, take care of the vegetation here, and the word we often translate here in our English translations in Genesis 2:15 is to cultivate and keep the garden. That's the way most English translations phrase this. But I would suggest that the word keep there is better translated by the word guard in English. It's the Hebrew word shamar, and just the next chapter, chapter 3, we find the same word again, and there it clearly means to guard. When the two angels were asked or commanded by God to guard the way to the tree of life. Here as well, in Genesis 2:15, we probably should translate it guard. The human being is to cultivate, take care of, and work the ground, and guard the garden. In other words, we're going to see that right from the beginning here, as soon as God enters into covenant relationship with human beings, part of the purpose of this relationship is that humans have a kingdom mission. Kingdom and covenant belong together right through Scripture as two twin themes. Now, we don't see it right away very clearly in this first two chapters, but in the third chapter, we see a serpent turn up that begins to paint a picture that not all is well in the garden. And we begin to get the first taste of a kingdom of darkness, and eventually, as the Bible unfolds, spiritual warfare, a theme that's become very important here at Woodland Hills. Covenant relationship and spiritual warfare, love and war. And we see it in a microcosm right here in the first opening of this covenantal relationship with God and Adam. You're put here to take care of the garden as well as to guard it, because there is a kingdom to guard against. Now, when God's done with this, the very next verse, we hear the first term. In fact, it's the only term of this covenant. This is a one-term covenant. It's going to be fascinating as we walk through the covenants with God to see how many terms each of God's covenants has with human beings. Eventually, we'll see that one of them is very different than the others. This first covenant, the creational covenant with Adam, only has one term, and it's this: do not eat of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God goes on then and says, for in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. Now, death and covenant breaking are something that are linked here and then right on through Scripture. It's very simple. God is our source of life, and He calls us into covenant love relationship with Himself. When human beings reject that, when they step away from God, essentially saying, no, I'd rather be God myself, what we do is we literally disconnect ourselves from our very source of life. We don't realize it in the moment, but what we're doing is we're choosing death by breaking covenant with God. When God says, in the day that you eat of this fruit of this tree, you surely shall die, it's not anything more than God simply describing the truth of what happens when humans break relationship from their source of life. To not be connected to your life source is to experience death. And so God, out of love, carefully explains that covenant is going to require staying connected to God, their life source. And to do that, God says, just don't eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We'll come back to that phrase in a minute and ask, what's so wrong about knowledge of good and evil? In fact, wouldn't it be helpful if we could know about good and evil so we'd know what to avoid and what to move towards? We'll come back to that phrase in a minute. First thing I want to look at is who the covenant partners are here. Now, in this first covenant, Genesis 2:16 and 17, it's clear that the only parties involved in this part of the narrative are God speaking to Adam, to the human being. Eve has not been created yet. And so we've got to stop for a minute, though, and ask the question, what does it mean that this first human being that God's covenanting with, that his name means humanity, human being? To get there, I want to talk about an important concept that we're not real familiar with in this culture, because our culture is one of rugged individualism or expressive individualism. We love individualism. And by individualism, I simply mean an individual-centered view of humanity. That when we think of humanity, we tend to think of individuals first, and then any kind of community of them is sort of a secondary thing. Like, what's really important about humans is that there are human beings who are individual. And yes, they form communities, and that could be friendships or churches or marriages. But those things sort of serve individuals and make their lives better and happier and those sorts of things. In the ancient world, it was not viewed that way. In the ancient world, what was seen as primary was community. And the phrase we'll use to identify this idea is simply this: corporate solidarity. Corporate solidarity. Corporate, of course, connotes the idea of a group of individuals, and solidarity, unification, solidified together. Okay, corporate solidarity. And by this we could mean, short definition, a community-centered view of humanity. Now, for us to understand this in this culture, we're going to have to talk about some ideas that, again, just won't naturally make sense to us. Ways the ancient world thought about themselves that we're going to have to kind of get inside their minds to make sense out of the covenants we're going to be seeing here. So, to unpack this notion of corporate solidarity, I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about corporate identity, corporate responsibility, and finally, corporate salvation. Okay, these are all three parts, you could say, of, or ways in which corporate solidarity was expressed in the ancient world. We'll start with corporate identity. To do that, I'd like to show you a diagram. In the ancient world, if you ask somebody, who are you? Tell me about yourself. Who are you? For someone really to process that question and answer in the ancient world, who is the me? Who am I? They're immediately going to start thinking about a triangulation of relationships that explains to themselves who they are. And that triangle of relationships is this. It's going to be the God they worship, the land where they live, the territory in which they live, and finally, the people that they are a part of, their community. In other words, in order for someone in the ancient world to have a clear sense of who they are, the way they get that sense of personal identity is by the interrelationship of the God they worship, the land where they live, and the people they are a part of. Now, why these three things are so interconnected in the ancient world is because in the ancient world of the ancient Near East, and probably for most cultures across the globe at this time, it was conceived of that there were many gods. Now, this is everyone but the Jews, of course. They believed in one God. But for everyone else, they believed in many gods, and they believed that the earth, planet Earth, was parceled up into different parts of real estate, and that a particular god was over each piece of real estate. And whatever people lived on a particular plot of ground or territory, that was the people who lived in that land who were to worship that god. So there's a strong relationship between God, land, and people. Now, when the Jews come along, or in the beginning when Adam is talking to the true God, the picture we get in Scripture is not of many gods over many pieces of land. It's of one God, Yahweh God, over all the earth, and all of the earth holds all of the people of the earth. So from Yahweh God's perspective, He is the only God over all the earth that all people should be in relationship with. And so back to that idea, whether it's many gods over many pieces of land, or one God for the Jews over one piece of land, the whole earth, in both cases, God, land, and people are intimately tied together and give individual human beings their sense of self, of who I am. Now, how we know this is the case, one example, is that in the ancient world, there was a very common form of punishment, a serious punishment, for high crimes within a particular region. And what's interesting about this form of punishment is that it would never work in our culture today. And of course, what we're talking about is banishment or exile. In this form of punishment, a community takes someone who's committed some crime in their culture and basically says to them, leave. That's it. That's the punishment. Just leave. They don't touch them, they don't hurt them. They just tell them to go and never come back. Now, from that ancient person's perspective, who gets their very sense of self from their God, their land, and their people, leaving their land, which means leaving their people, is a disastrous thing for their sense of self. In other words, banishment takes a person outside of that triangular relationship. At least that's how they conceived of it. I saw a film once in which this idea of banishment was being portrayed. And a man who had been banished met another person on the road while he was traveling, was asked his name. And the man's answer was, "My name is Nobody." That became his name. He said he felt like he lost his real name when he had been sent away, because that was his sense of self within his people group. Now that he was alone and banished, he didn't even possess a first name any longer. He was simply, "I have no name." This is really an important element to grasp as we begin to understand how deeply tied together the sense of human community was for the scriptures that we're going to be looking at. So that's corporate identity. Now, how this plays out is a number of ways. One is corporate responsibility, another corporate salvation that we'll be looking at here. Corporate responsibility first. Let's take King David as an example of this in the Old Testament. Two moments of David's life where we see David acting as a figurehead for the entire nation of Israel. David and what happens with him is responsible for what happens to the entire nation of Israel. Two moments in David's life. One positive, one not so much, right? First one is when David goes out to meet Goliath, the famous battle between David and Goliath. David's young and small. Goliath is a well-trained warrior and huge. And we know from the story that what the setup was is that these two nations had agreed that two individuals would fight on the battlefield, but whichever individual won, their entire army would win. That's an example of corporate responsibility. If one person wins the battle, their entire people group, their entire army wins the battle. Now, in this case, we know that David won the battle. And as soon as he did, the Philistine army granted that they had lost. Just because their one person had lost, right? Corporate responsibility. What happens to one representative happens to everybody of that people group or nation. Second moment in David's life. This comes years later after he's been king. And it says in Scripture that David decided to number or count his military troops. Now, God had said in the law never to do this, never to count military troops, because it would be a sign that they weren't trusting in God's power and providence, but rather they were trusting in their own might. But David did this one day, and God called him on the carpet for it and challenged him and said, "Because you've done this, there's got to be consequences. You've broken law, and consequence must happen." Now, he gave David the choice of what consequence he could pick. His three options were, I think, something along these lines. 3 days of plague would sweep through the nation Israel, 3 months of war, or 3 years of famine. Plague, war, or famine. Now, David decided to go with the shortest of the 3 days of plague. And it says that 70,000 Israelites perished in this terrible plague that came through the nation of Israel. But David, he was fine. He didn't die. How's that fair, we might say, from our cultural context of individualism? David sinned. David should die. But not in an ancient corporate solidarity context. In that context, David, as the covenant leader, the covenant representative of his nation, sinned, and it's his nation that pays for that crime. That's what happens with corporate responsibility. Now, we don't have a lot of that type of thing left in our culture, certainly not with regard to laws. We don't have a law that if one person does a crime, someone else pays for it. But we do or can see this working still to some degree in our culture. For example, we see this a lot with sports teams, right? In Minnesota here, if you're a Vikings fan, which most of us are, and if the Vikings win, We in Minnesota say, we won. Now, most of us weren't on the playing field, but it's a sense in which this small group of people represents an entire state, right? Corporate solidarity in a sense. Now, I've also heard we don't take this too far, because as some of my college students have told me, when the Vikings win, we win, but when the Vikings lose, they lost. We don't lose. Depends how closely we get tied to our group. Another example in which we see this on a biological level. We know that parents can sometimes, particularly a woman who's pregnant, can make choices and, say, ingest things into her body that can harm the fetus. This is an example where the choice of someone directly and negatively affects someone else. On the other hand, when a mother who's able to eat well and be as healthy as possible tends to, have a positive effect on the fetus. This shows that we do have a sense in our culture that what someone does can affect someone else, even though they had nothing to do with the decision. It's just that in the ancient world, this was a much broader and deeper concept, corporate responsibility. Finally, corporate salvation. Third piece of our corporate solidarity. So we have corporate identity, that a person's identity is tied up with their community. Corporate responsibility, that what one representative does affects the whole group. And finally, corporate salvation. This is going to be a really important concept to understand salvation in the Bible. What we're going to find as we move through the covenants is that God works to save a people. God's not interested in just saving a loose collection of individuals. He's after a family, brothers and sisters, who he is the father over. And so saving a community, corporate salvation, is a very, very crucial concept to understanding the covenants and finally the new covenant in Jesus Christ. So when we say, we're back to our question now, who are the partners of this first covenant? Well, it is Adam and God, yes. But here's the point. Since the word Adam, or Adam, means human being, what's really going on is this first human is our covenant representative. Yes, it's about Adam and God, but it's not just about Adam and God. It is about Adam and every human being who will come forth from Adam, and in a moment, Eve. It's interesting. Adam, that name again, means human being, and the name Eve, the first woman, means mother of all. So what we see in Adam and Eve is not just Adam and Eve, but the first human parents of an entire race of people, image of God people. Every human being comes forth from this first prototypical human being and the mother of all. That means that these two people are our covenant representatives, our very first covenant representatives. Now, unfortunately, they don't do so well. And their choice, as we'll see in Genesis 3, affects all of us. That negative choice to rebel against God. The good news is going to be that another representative will come, Jesus Christ, a new covenant representative. And what Jesus does will also have a beneficial effect for all human beings, as he calls all people to himself.